Welcome. Today we are going to attempt to make graphs in Excel. You can use this for graphing for your labs or for any graphs that you need to make for any other classes or in college. So to start off with, we need some sample data, which I have loaded here. I'm going to be making two graphs, a distance time graph and a velocity time graph. Well, the first thing that I need to do is I need to select the data that I want to graph. I want to graph time, so I'm going to select the entire column for time and the entire column for distance, since my first graph is going to be a distance time graph. I'm now going to come up to the edit button, to the insert button, insert. And I want to insert a scatter plot. Okay, there is my scatter plot. Now, it automatically will graph the first thing that you select, which in my case was time, on the x-axis, and the second thing that you select, in my case distance, on the y-axis. And that looks pretty good, except I've got some things here that I don't actually want graphed. So what I'm going to do is I am going to tell it, no, I want to select certain data. So I hit the Select Data button over here on the side. And I want to turn off the cell for time, the blank cell that I had, and I actually want to turn off 0 in my case. And then I'm going to hit OK. Notice how my graph has changed. Now this is a fairly acceptable graph, but it's missing a few things. So let's go and add some things to my graph. First thing I want to add is I want to add the titles to my axes, because every axis should have a title and unit. Now, in the case of our first graph, the units are given to us here, in the case of my graph that I've been given. Okay, where my first, we said that's what's on the x-axis, is time. So I'm just going to remove where it says axis title, and I'm going to put in time in seconds. And now I'm going to add my vertical title. And this one is distance in meters. And now my axes are labeled. I also want to put a title on my graph. I like to put it above the chart, and this is going to be Graph 1. And usually we call it the x value's effect on the y value, but in this case I can simply say distance versus time. And that looks very good like that. Now there are some other little things that you can do if you wish. You can put in some extra grid lines, vertical grid lines as well as horizontal. That's how I do those. I don't need those, but I can put them in there. I can also put in a legend bar if I want to. A legend bar would be helpful if I have multiple things that I'm graphing, but I don't have that, so I don't need to put that in. One thing I do want to put in, though, is a trend line. If you notice, when we looked at our graph has a definite curve to it. So I can't put in just a linear trend line. That doesn't match the relationship that I'm seeing. It's also not exponential, and you can see that as well. So I'm going to go to More Trend Line Options. And my More Trend Line Options or over here? I have a choice over here of my different trend line options. And I'm going to select a polynomial. And when I select a polynomial, you can see that that dotted line, which matches my trend, practically disappears under the line that I put in. That tells me that that's what type of line we do have. Now I want to make my trend line a little more obvious. So I'm going to give it a little bit of character, a little bit of a glow, or you could put in a shadow if you prefer, but something that will set that apart so that we can see where the trend is. And I'm going to change the color of my little dots, and I'm going to make them a little bit bigger so they're easier to see. And with that, this graph is done. And I'm going to put this over to the side. Oops. I'm going to put my entire graph over to the side because I have another graph that I want to make now. I now want to graph two columns that are not next to each other. My second graph that I want to make is time and final velocity. So rather than hold down the Shift key, because if I hold down the Shift key, I'm going to select everything, and I don't want that. I'm going to select time, which I still want on my x-axis, and now I'm going to hold down the Control key, and I'm going to select final velocity. And then I'm going to do exactly the same thing that I did before, where I'm going to insert the same type of scatter line that I did before. Now, again, I've got some values here that I don't want. So I'm going to go back up to Select Data, and I'm going to turn off my cell that said time, my blank cell, and again, I'm also going to select to turn off my 0, and hit OK. And that straightens my graph out a little bit. Now, I do want to emphasize that this is data that I made up, so that's why it looks kind of strange in this region here and appears very normal there. When you have your own normally generated data, you won't get a graph that looks like this. So I now want to add the same things that I added before. I'm going to add a title to my axes. My x-axis, again is going to be time in seconds. My y-axis will be final velocity in meters per second. My title for my graph will be graph 2, final velocity versus time. And the last thing that I want to do again is add a trend line. Now in this case, I should have a linear trend line. And it does mostly match a linear line. And I'm going to do exactly the same thing that I did before. I want to make my trend line stand out. This time I'll use a shadow on it. And I'm going to change that shadow's color. And make my trend line a little bit bigger so that I can see it. Wrong way. And that is the basics of making a graph in Excel. Remember, you have to have your data pre-selected. before you select Insert the Graph. This is one of many different types of graphs that you can make, and this is a very good and useful skill to have. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed our little video.